August 21st. An American spy reports to Washington that Lower Long Island, what is now Brooklyn, will be the first target of the British. Washington rushes in reinforcements.
We immediately start fortifying our positions. Fear is a great inspiration for hard work. I have my gun, canteen, knapsack, and a blanket. It's my first battle. Will I be able to kill someone else?
The next morning, under cover of the formidable guns of the British Navy, 15,000 British troops land unopposed at the southern tip of Long Island. Waiting behind defensive barricades 3 miles away are the Americans. They are outnumbered 2 to 1. The British regiments, in dense formation, march up the open fields toward the heights. Their plan? To crush the rebellion in one decisive battle.
The British advance to within about 300 yards of us and begin a very heavy fire. Bullets and shells fly very fast, now and then taking off ahead.
It's very, very difficult to reconstruct these extraordinary battles of the past. But they did indeed form up in dense ranks, very carefully ordered. They did march up to within musket shot of each other with the officers in front. And they did fire at each other at very close range indeed. A man firing at another 100 yards away had almost no chance of hitting him. The ball might go anywhere. So the only way you could be certain of inflicting casualties on the enemy was to mass your men as closely as possible together. So both sides formed up into compact clumps and fired at each other, each hoping that the other would run away.
Once you would have loaded for the first volley, fired your first volley, returned your musket, and reloaded, the noise was such that there was no hearing anything. You couldn't hear commands. You'd be very lucky if you could hear a drum beat, for instance, which was one of the reasons they used drums for various commands once the volleying started. But it was then fire at will, and you just kept firing until you heard either a drum beat or somebody yelling in your ear, cease fire, cease fire. There was no organization after about the third volley.
The Patriots hold the high ground. They shoot down on the advancing enemy soldiers. The British realize that they must change tactics or suffer heavy casualties.
Howe was a professional. When he came over with his troops, he immediately sent out his light dragoons to scout the territory. He also had some local Tories that were guiding him, and they found out that the passway over on the American left was virtually unguarded. The Americans, not knowing any topography, they just slipped up, and they left the Jamaica Pass unguarded.
With half their forces in the front, keeping the Americans occupied, a division of 10,000 British soldiers marches undetected through the Jamaica Pass to a position behind the American lines.
Our men stand amazingly well until 12 o'clock, when the main party of British, by a route we never dreamt of, surround us.
Suddenly they looked around, and here was Howe's army coming up behind them. Here was Howe's army coming up on the side. They had to control the line. Which way could they fire? They simply broke and they ran.
The Americans have only one escape route, through the Gowanus Marsh. The British slaughter the fleeing soldiers.
I can't describe the confusion and the horror of the scene. Artillery flying, our men running in every direction, and everywhere we turn, we meet the British or the Hessians. Men up to their knees in mud, screaming for help. Everyone else running to save their own skins.
It was a catastrophe. And partly it's American amateurism at fighting this kind of big battle. They'd never fought a battle on that scale before. They'd never had an organization that was designed to fight that kind of battle before. This is new, and they got clobbered.
The rebels have courage, but British discipline wins the day. They're raw troops, never seen action before. Their officers have no understanding of the strategies of war. The Maryland soldiers were from the best families in the province. They were heroes, cut down in the bloom of their youth. The pursuit and slaughter lasted for many hours.
At that moment, in late August of 1776, it really looks as if you're going to lose the war in the first battle, just as the British commanders had predicted you would. British planning is based on the idea of one big decisive battle, and this looks like it, the Battle of Long Island.
The Americans have retreated to Brooklyn Heights. Facing them is the British Army. At their backs is the East River. Almost the entire Continental Army is trapped. The British wait for Washington to surrender.
In the 18th century, in European warfare, it wasn't just a question of winning, but it was also a question of how you won. In a way, it was better to lose well than to win badly. That was they thought the form and ritual of warfare was very important, and wished to behave like gentlemen at all times.
According to the gentlemanly rules of warfare, Washington should concede defeat. Instead, when night falls and a thick fog blankets the East River, he orders his troops to keep all their campfires burning. Then, quietly, he begins to ferry men, horses, and cannon back to Manhattan, a few boatloads at a time. By morning, the entire American army has crossed over to New York.
And the British finally discovered that the fortifications were no longer occupied. They rushed through down to the bank just as the last boat was pulling away. And the last man in the last boat was George Washington.
The British are stunned.
Washington should be very grateful to General Howe. What a kind enemy we are. Instead of crushing the frightened, trembling enemy at once, he generously gives him time to recover from his panic and regroup. 20,000 of our best men stand on the banks of the East River, like Moses looking at the promised land, with the rebel flags waving insolently in the air. The troops and officers couldn't believe that they were just standing there, not doing anything.
The American army may have escaped capture, but the British now occupy Brooklyn Heights. Their guns are trained on New York. Washington realizes that the city cannot be held. His soldiers grab everything they can, including the city's church bells, to be melted into bullets, and begin a retreat up Manhattan Island. The British move in to occupy New York City.
You can't imagine the joy of the city's inhabitants when we march in. Pure bedlam. They carry the king's officers on their shoulders. A woman pulls down the rebels' hated flag and stamps on it with contempt and indignation.
Most New Yorkers are fervently loyal to England, not to the Revolution. Indeed, about 1/5 of the entire American population will remain loyalists throughout the war. They must keep their political views to themselves in areas where patriots are in control. But here in New York, it is the supporters of the Revolution who must keep quiet or leave.
We have fled. It was raining and thundering so hard we had to stop by the side of the road all night. When we did find a place to stay, all we got was a dirty bed on the floor. It's very hard for us that are used to living comfortable.
Travelers will carry the accounts of the disaster in New York along the dirt roads and rivers of 18th century America. It will take over a month for the news to spread to all 13 states. Near Boston, an anxious Abigail Adams writes to her husband John in Congress in Philadelphia.
My dearest friend, there are so many rumors flying around that it is impossible to know what to believe. Did you think that we would be able to hold on to Long Island? If we could not hold Long Island, are they going to take New York City? And if they hold New York, will they be able to cut off New England from the rest of the colonies?
My best friend, I assure you that we in Congress are as much at a loss to understand what happened in New York as you are. In general, our generals were out-generaled on Long Island. Every time our militia see the British, they very courageously panic, turn their backs, and run away. Our Massachusetts men behave just as badly as everyone else.
As the British move in to occupy New York City, the Continental Army continues its retreat up through the countryside of Manhattan Island. It is not an orderly withdrawal. Troops that Washington has positioned to protect the rear of his fleeing army are themselves running at the first sight of British guns. Washington explodes into a rage.
And it's one of the few times he really lost his temper. He threw his hat on the ground, he was on horseback. He yelled at them, screamed at them. He had his horse whipped, and he was actually whipping some of the officers as well as the men. And finally, he just gave up. All of this terrible pressure and disgust on him, he just sat there limply with Hessians coming at him just 80 yards away. And at that point, one of his aides de camp grabbed his horse and led him away.